"No entry without proper credentials," barked the stern-faced security officer, hand raised like a barrier against the elderly man in the weathered uniform. "Medal ceremonies restricted access, sir. I need to see official ID, not just your old service papers." The veteran's weathered face fell, decades of pride crumbling in an instant of rejection. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Lieutenant Colonel James "Jimmy" Mitchell stood at the edge of the crowd, his faded dress blues hanging loosely on his once sturdy frame. At 82, the Vietnam veteran's posture still held traces of military bearing, though time had taken its toll. The years had whitened his close-cropped hair and deepened the lines around his eyes that had witnessed horrors most civilians couldn't imagine and triumphs few would understand. Jimmy lived alone in a modest bungalow on the outskirts of Riverside, California, its small rooms filled with memories rather than luxury. His days followed a predictable rhythm. Morning coffee on the porch, watching neighborhood children wait for school buses, afternoon walks to the corner store where the owner always greeted him by name, and evenings spent with books about history he'd helped shape but rarely spoke of. His most cherished possessions weren't displayed prominently. In a hand-carved wooden box tucked away in his bedroom drawer lay medals rarely seen by visitors. Among them, a silver star and purple heart that told silent stories of courage under fire. Alongside them rested brittle photographs of young men, in jungle fatigues, their arms draped around each other's shoulders, faces bearing the complex mixture of fear and brotherhood that only combat forges. Every Thursday, Jimmy volunteered at the local Veterans Affairs Clinic, not counseling officially, but simply sitting with younger veterans, offering the quiet understanding that comes only from shared experience. He never initiated conversations about his own service, preferring instead to listen, a skill that had saved lives in the dense jungles of Vietnam and now helped heal invisible wounds decades later. Today was different. The Pentagon was hosting its centennial celebration of the Battle of Quang Tri, a pivotal engagement during the Easter Offensive of 1972. Jimmy had received an embossed invitation 6 weeks prior, not from the main organizing committee, but personally from Colonel Rebecca Hayes, a military historian who'd interviewed him extensively for her doctoral thesis on tactical leadership during Vietnam's most chaotic periods. "Your first-hand accounts were invaluable to my research," her handwritten note read. "The ceremony will include the dedication of a permanent exhibit featuring the radio transmissions you preserved. Your presence would mean everything to the authenticity of this recognition." Jimmy had initially set the invitation aside, uncomfortable with the prospect of public attention. His wartime experiences weren't something he discussed casually, and Washington, D.C. seemed a world away from his quiet California life. But dreams of fallen comrades had visited him with increasing frequency since the invitation arrived, faces young and determined, seemingly asking him to bear witness on their behalf. After 2 weeks of deliberation, he'd called his neighbors, son for help purchasing a plane ticket, his first flight in over 15 years. He'd carefully pressed his dress blues, polished the tarnished buttons, and sewn loose threads with arthritic but determined fingers. The uniform hung more loosely than it once had, but it remained a symbol of service he wore with quiet dignity. The morning of the ceremony dawned clear and cool in Washington, D.C., cherry blossoms beginning their annual display along the Potomac. Jimmy had arrived the previous evening, staying in a modest hotel recommended by Colonel Hayes. He'd risen before dawn, an old habit never abandoned, giving himself ample time to prepare both physically and mentally for a day that would resurrect. Memories long compartmentalized. He'd taken a taxi to the Pentagon, the massive building looming before him like a concrete monument to power and purpose. Security checkpoints dotted the approach, each more formidable than the last. Men and women in crisp, modern uniforms directed an elegant procession of military brass, politicians and distinguished guests toward a cordoned entrance marked Centennial. Celebration, authorized personnel only. Jimmy approached the final checkpoint, invitation in hand, his pace slowed by both age and the emotional weight of returning to a world he'd left decades ago. The crowd around him was different from what he'd expected. Younger officers in immaculate dress uniforms, civilian officials in tailored suits, journalists with credential badges hanging prominently around their necks. He felt immediately out of place, his vintage uniform a relic among modern military precision. The security officer at the checkpoint, Staff Sergeant Melanie Torres, according to her nameplate, looked barely older than his youngest granddaughter. Her eyes scanned the approaching crowd with professional efficiency, checking digital credentials against a tablet in her hand. "Good morning, sir," she said as Jimmy approached, her tone polite but impersonal. "May I see your official credentials and ID?" Jimmy handed her the embossed invitation and his veteran's ID card, worn at the edges from years in his wallet. "Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell," he said. "I was invited by Colonel Hayes for the Quang Tri recognition." Torres frowned slightly, her fingers tapping rapidly on her tablet. "I'm not seeing your name on our security clearance list, sir." Her eyes moved from the screen to his uniform, noting its age and the slight misalignment of insignia. "This appears to be a courtesy invitation, not an official security credential." "Colonel Hayes sent it personally," Jimmy explained, feeling a familiar tightness in his chest, not anxiety over potential rejection, but the deeper discomfort of having to explain his presence, to justify his belonging. "She's including my radio recordings in the new exhibit." Torres looked sympathetic but unmoved. "I understand, sir, but Pentagon protocol requires current security clearance for all attendees. Your veteran status is appreciated, but without proper credentials." She gestured vaguely at his uniform. "And, sir, I should mention that current dress code regulations have changed significantly. Your uniform doesn't conform to present standards. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." A few people in line behind Jimmy shifted impatiently. A journalist nearby glanced over with professional curiosity, perhaps sensing a human interest angle. Jimmy felt suddenly conspicuous, a disruption in the smoothly functioning machinery of the event. "Is there someone who could contact Colonel Hayes?" Jimmy asked, his voice steady despite the growing discomfort. "She specifically asked me to attend." Torres sighed, the sound balanced between professionalism and impatience. "Colonel Hayes is currently with the Secretary of Defense and the Joint Chiefs preparing for the ceremony. I can't interrupt them for a credential issue." She looked at the growing line behind Jimmy. "I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. Sir, perhaps you could watch the live stream of the event from the visitor center." The suggestion landed like a physical blow. Watch from the visitor center, separated from the actual ceremony by walls of security and protocol, distanced from the recognition of battles he'd helped win and comrades who had sacrificed everything. Jimmy's shoulders, which had maintained their military bearing despite his years, seemed to lower slightly under an invisible weight. "The invitation doesn't mention anything about additional credentials," Jimmy noted quietly, pointing to the official Pentagon seal embossed on the heavy cardstock. Torres's expression hardened slightly. "Sir, I don't make the rules. Pentagon security has been significantly enhanced since your service days. I need to clear people who have proper authorization." Her voice rose just enough to be heard by those nearby. "You're holding up the line. Please step aside." Jimmy didn't argue further. Decades of military discipline had taught him when battles couldn't be won through direct engagement. He nodded once, tucked the invitation back into his jacket pocket. and stepped away from the checkpoint, finding a quiet spot near a memorial wall where he could collect his thoughts. From his position, he could see the entrance to the auditorium where the ceremony would take place. Through glass doors, he glimpsed elaborate displays, large photographs, tactical maps, and glass cases presumably containing artifacts from the battle. One display featured what looked like vintage radio equipment, similar to what he'd operated during those critical days in 1972. His recordings, the very reason for his invitation, would likely be played in that room, his voice echoing across decades while he stood outside, separated by invisible barriers of bureaucracy. Jimmy wasn't angry. Anger required more energy than he cared to expend these days. Instead, he felt a profound weariness, a resignation born from a lifetime of witnessing how systems often valued procedure over people. He understood Torres was simply doing her job, following protocols established long after his time in service. Yet understanding didn't diminish the sting of exclusion from a ceremony meant to honor the very conflict that had shaped his life's trajectory. He considered leaving entirely, returning to his hotel and catching an earlier flight home to California. What purpose was served by lingering here on the periphery? Colonel Hayes would understand once he explained the situation. She might even apologize for not arranging proper clearance, though the oversight wasn't truly her fault. The Pentagon operated by its own intricate rules, a reality he'd known intimately during his years of service. Yet something kept him rooted in place. The same quiet determination that had sustained him through monsoon seasons and enemy fire decades earlier. He'd traveled across the country not for personal recognition, but to bear witness for those who couldn't be here. The men whose voices were preserved in his recordings, but whose lives had ended in distant jungles. Leaving now felt like abandoning them a second time. Jimmy watched as other attendees streamed through the checkpoint, credentials accepted without question. Military officers in current-issue dress uniforms moved with confident familiarity through the security protocols. Distinguished civilians with visitor badges were escorted by uniformed personnel. Everyone seemed to belong except the man who had actually been there, who carried Quang Tri not just in his memories, but in his nightmares. Staff Sergeant Torres occasionally glanced in his direction, perhaps wondering why he remained. Once, she seemed about to approach him, but another wave of arrivals demanded her attention. Jimmy simply stood at parade rest, a position so deeply ingrained in his muscle memory that it provided comfort in its familiarity. His weathered hands clasped behind his back, eyes forward, patient as only those who have endured prolonged combat can be. A young army lieutenant noticed him standing there and approached with respectful curiosity. "Vietnam?" he asked, nodding toward the campaign ribbons on Jimmy's chest. Jimmy nodded. "Yes, 1st Cavalry Division." "My grandfather was 1st Cav," the lieutenant said, his expression brightening. "Were you here for the Quang Tri ceremony?" "Trying to be," Jimmy replied with a slight smile. "Seems my clearance didn't make the list." The lieutenant frowned. "That's not right. This whole ceremony is about honoring Quang Tri veterans." He hesitated, then added, "Let me see if I can help. My CO is inside already. Maybe he can reach someone." Before Jimmy could respond, the lieutenant was striding toward another security checkpoint, speaking rapidly into his radio. Jimmy watched him go, touched by the gesture but harboring little hope. The military operated on protocol and chain of command, principles he respected even when they worked against his interests. Minutes ticked by, stretching into nearly half an hour. The flow of arrivals had diminished to a trickle, suggesting the ceremony would begin soon. Jimmy remained at his post by the memorial wall, increasingly certain he would indeed be watching the proceedings from the distant visitor center, if at all. Then the atmosphere shifted. A commotion near the main entrance drew attention as several high-ranking officers emerged from a secure area, moving with purpose toward the checkpoint. Leading them was a woman whose bearing commanded immediate respect, tall, grey-haired, with the unmistakable presence of senior command. 4 stars gleamed on each shoulder of her immaculate uniform. General Eleanor Madison, current Vice Chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and one of the highest-ranking women in American military history, was not scheduled to appear at the security checkpoint. Her presence there caused an immediate ripple effect. Security personnel straightened to attention, conversations hushed, and all eyes tracked her deliberate progress through the lobby. General Madison paused briefly to speak with an aide, then continued her determined path, not toward the auditorium where dignitaries were gathering, but directly toward the elderly man standing quietly by the memorial wall. Staff Sergeant Torres watched wide-eyed as the 4-star general bypassed the security station entirely, her focus fixed solely on the veteran in the outdated uniform. Jimmy noticed the approaching general and instinctively straightened his posture further. Years falling away as military discipline reasserted itself in the presence of superior rank. He didn't immediately recognize General Madison. Their paths had never crossed during his active service, but he recognized the authority she carried as naturally as she wore her uniform. The general stopped directly in front of Jimmy, her expression unreadable. For a moment she simply studied him, taking in the vintage uniform, the campaign ribbons, the dignified bearing that decades of civilian life hadn't erased. Then, to the astonishment of everyone watching, General Madison raised her right hand in a precise, formal salute. "Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent lobby. "Radio operator, tactical, communications specialist, 1st Cavalry Division, Quang Tri, 1972. Jimmy, momentarily stunned by this unexpected recognition, recovered quickly and returned the salute with practiced precision. "General," he acknowledged, his voice steady despite his surprise. Madison lowered her hand, a genuine smile warming her authoritative demeanor. "Colonel Mitchell, your presence here today isn't just welcomed, it's essential. Your radio transmissions from Firebase Bastogne during the Easter offensive are the cornerstone of our historical exhibit." Her smile faded as she glanced toward the security checkpoint. "May I ask why you're waiting out here instead of inside where the recognition is about to begin?" Before Jimmy could answer, Staff Sergeant Torres approached, her earlier confidence replaced by visible concern. "General Madison, there was a security protocol issue. The colonel's name wasn't on our clearance list, and his credentials—" Madison's raised hand silenced Torres mid-explanation. The general's expression wasn't angry, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. "Sergeant, are you telling me that the man whose actual voice will be played during today's ceremony, the man who coordinated artillery support that saved hundreds of American lives at Quang Tri, was denied entry because of administrative oversight?" Torres swallowed visibly. "Ma'am, I was following security protocols. His name wasn't on the list, and regulations regarding vintage uniforms—" "Protocols," General Madison repeated, the word carrying layers of meaning. She turned back to Jimmy, something like apology in her eyes. "Colonel Mitchell, it seems, we've become so focused on following procedures that we've forgotten who those procedures were designed to honor in the first place." She gestured toward his uniform. "That uniform may not meet current regulations, Colonel, but it was worn with honor in defense of this nation when it mattered most. The medals on your chest weren't earned in training exercises or peacetime deployments, but in some of the most challenging combat conditions American forces have ever faced." The general turned, addressing not just Torres, but everyone within earshot. security personnel, late arriving guests, and curious onlookers. Her voice projected with the practiced command of someone accustomed to being heard across battlefield noise. This ceremony today, this entire centennial recognition, exists because men like Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell answered when their country called. The battle maps we've meticulously recreated for the exhibit, they're accurate because of the coordinates he transmitted under enemy fire, the timeline of the North Vietnamese advance, documented through his radio logs when other communications were compromised. Madison's gaze swept across the assembled faces, her expression stern but not unkind. I understand protocols and security requirements. I've implemented many of them myself. But when our protocols prevent us from properly honoring the very people those protocols were designed to protect, we've lost our way. She turned back to Jimmy, her formal demeanor softening. Colonel Mitchell, I believe Colonel Hayes is wondering where you are. The ceremony cannot properly begin without you. She offered her arm in a gesture of both respect and support. Would you allow me to escort you personally? Jimmy, deeply moved but maintaining his composure, nodded once. I would be honored, General. As Madison prepared to escort Jimmy through the checkpoint, an aide hurried forward, concern evident on his face. General Madison, ma'am, with respect, this breaks at least 3 security protocols. The Secretary's team will need to... The Secretary will understand perfectly, Madison interrupted, her tone brooking no argument. And if he doesn't, he can take it up with me directly. She nodded toward Jimmy. This man's security clearance was high enough to coordinate artillery for an entire division during wartime. I think he can be trusted at a ceremonial event. The aide hesitated, then stepped back with a crisp, "Yes, ma'am." General Madison looked at Staff Sergeant Torres, who stood rigidly at attention. Her voice gentled slightly. "Sergeant, I understand you were following established protocols. That's what good soldiers do, but the best soldiers also know when humanity must take precedence over procedure." Torres nodded, visibly processing the lesson. "Yes, General. I apologize, Colonel Mitchell." Her apology seemed genuine. The words of someone recognizing a mistake rather than merely acknowledging a reprimand. With that addressed, General Madison escorted Jimmy through the security checkpoint without further delay, her presence overriding any remaining procedural obstacles. Before he could decide, his cell phone chimed with a message from Colonel Hayes. "The Secretary hopes you might stay an extra day. There's interest in having you participate in a follow-up panel discussion on veteran recognition. Car will collect you at 0900 if you're willing." Jimmy sat on the edge of his bed, considering this unexpected turn. He had planned to fly home today, returning to his quiet routine in Riverside. The thought of extending his time in the spotlight made him uncomfortable, yet he recognized something significant was happening, something that might benefit veterans beyond himself. After a moment's reflection, he texted his acceptance to Colonel Hayes. At precisely 0900, a black government sedan arrived at the hotel entrance. Jimmy, dressed in civilian clothes today, pressed khakis and a blue button-down shirt, was surprised to find not a junior officer but Colonel Hayes herself waiting beside the vehicle. "Good morning, Colonel Mitchell," she greeted him warmly. "I hope you don't mind the change in transportation arrangements. After yesterday's incident, the Secretary wanted to ensure you received appropriate courtesy." Her expression conveyed genuine regret for his initial reception. "The car is appreciated but unnecessary," Jimmy replied with a slight smile. "I've navigated public transportation in places far more challenging than Washington." Hayes nodded respectfully. "I don't doubt that, sir. Nevertheless, consider it a small correction to yesterday's oversight." As they drove toward the Pentagon, Hayes briefed Jimmy on the morning's schedule. "What began as a simple panel discussion has evolved somewhat overnight. The Secretary mentioned your situation during his staff meeting, and it resonated strongly. Several department heads expressed concern that your experience might reflect broader systemic issues affecting veteran participation. Jimmy looked thoughtful. One incident hardly constitutes a pattern. Perhaps, Hayes acknowledged, but it raised important questions. How many veterans simply turn away when faced with similar barriers? How many voices and perspectives are we losing because our protocols prioritize procedure over purpose? She glanced at him. Your willingness to remain despite that initial rejection made you visible. Many others might have simply left. The car passed through security checkpoints with remarkable efficiency. Jimmy's name now prominently listed on every clearance roster. Staff Sergeant Torres was notably absent from her previous post, though Jimmy spotted her later inside the building, now assigned to escort duty for visiting veterans. The conference room designated for the panel discussion was already filled beyond capacity when they arrived. What had been planned as a modest follow-up event had transformed overnight into something larger and more significant. Jimmy recognized several high-ranking officers from the previous day's ceremony, alongside policy advisors and program directors he didn't know. General Madison sat near the center, engaged in conversation with a silver-haired man Jimmy recognized as the Secretary of Defense. The room quieted as Jimmy entered. Secretary Carson rose immediately, approaching with extended hand. Colonel Mitchell, thank you for joining us today. What happened yesterday has prompted some overdue conversations about how we honor our veterans, particularly those from earlier conflicts. Jimmy shook the offered hand, slightly uncomfortable with the attention but determined to maintain his composure. Happy to help in any way I can, Mr. Secretary. Carson guided Jimmy to a seat at the main table rather than the audience area, positioning him between General Madison and a distinguished-looking civilian introduced as Dr. Lawrence Winters, Director of Veterans Affairs Integration. The symbolism wasn't subtle. Jimmy had been placed literally at the center of the conversation. Before we begin formally, Secretary Carson addressed the room, I want to establish the context for today's discussion. Yesterday, a decorated combat veteran who received a personal invitation to our centennial ceremony was initially denied entry due to credential and uniform regulations. Only the direct intervention of General Madison prevented what would have been a profound failure in our mission to honor those who served. Carson's gaze swept the assembled officials. This isn't about assigning blame to any individual. The security officer was following established protocols. Rather, this incident reveals how our systems, designed with good intentions, can create barriers that disproportionately impact the very people we seek to recognize. The secretary nodded toward Jimmy. Colonel Mitchell has graciously agreed to share his perspective as we examine how to address these issues systematically. I expect this conversation to produce actionable recommendations, not just expressions of regret. What followed was unlike any meeting Jimmy had anticipated. Rather than the performative acknowledgement he expected, the discussion delved deeply into practical challenges veterans faced when engaging with military institutions. General Madison expertly guided the conversation, ensuring Jimmy's experiences were centered without placing undue burden on him to represent all veterans. Colonel Mitchell, Madison asked at one point, beyond yesterday's specific incident, what barriers have you observed that might prevent veterans, particularly from Vietnam and earlier conflicts, from participating in commemorative events? Jimmy considered the question carefully. Distance is perhaps the most obvious, he began. Many of us live far from Washington and major military installations. Travel becomes more challenging with age. He paused, then continued with quiet frankness. But the less visible barriers are often more significant. Many veterans, especially from Vietnam, carry complicated feelings about recognition. We returned to a divided country where many treated our service as something shameful rather than honorable. That leaves scars that don't show on medical records. For some, he added, the formality of modern military events feels alienating. The protocols, the security measures, the emphasis on current standards, it can make veterans feel like outsiders to an institution that was once their home. Yesterday, being told my uniform didn't meet regulations felt like being told my service itself was somehow insufficient by today's standards. His words landed with visible impact around the table. Dr. Winters from Veterans Affairs nodded thoughtfully. Colonel Mitchell articulates something we've observed in participation data. Attendance at commemorative events skews heavily toward recent service periods. Vietnam veterans participate at significantly lower rates, even accounting for age and health factors. The conversation expanded to include practical suggestions, satellite ceremonies in locations more accessible to aging veterans, transportation, assistance programs, adjustments to security protocols that maintain safety while reducing bureaucratic barriers. Throughout, Jimmy offered measured insights drawn from his own experiences and observations from the VA clinic where he volunteered. As the discussion progressed, a uniformed woman at the far end of the table raised her hand. Permission to speak. Candidly, Mr. Secretary. At Carson's nod, she continued, I believe we're overlooking a fundamental issue. Our commemorative events have become increasingly performative, designed to look impressive in media coverage rather than to create meaningful connection with veterans. We prioritize high-profile guests and camera-ready moments over authentic recognition. Her comments sparked a wave of uncomfortable recognition around the table. Secretary Carson nodded slowly. Major Chen makes an excellent point. Our ceremonies have perhaps become more about institutional image than genuine honor. General Madison turned to Jimmy. Colonel Mitchell, what would meaningful recognition look like from your perspective? Beyond logistical improvements, how might we ensure commemorative events truly honor service? Jimmy hadn't expected to be positioned as an authority on institutional reform, but he considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. In my experience, most veterans don't seek elaborate recognition. What matters most is acknowledgement that our service, regardless of when or where we served, remains valued in the present, not just catalogued as history. He gestured toward the room. This conversation itself demonstrates meaningful recognition, not because it's focused on my experience specifically, but because it takes veterans' perspectives seriously enough to influence policy. That's ultimately more significant than any ceremony, however well-intentioned. The meeting continued for nearly 3 hours, far longer than originally scheduled. What had begun as a discussion about security protocols evolved into a comprehensive examination of how military institutions engage with veterans across generations. By its conclusion, Secretary Carson had authorized the formation of a dedicated task force to implement reforms, with Jimmy invited to serve as a civilian advisor, an offer he accepted with quiet pride. As the meeting adjourned, attendees gathered, in smaller groups, continuing discussions with new energy. Jimmy found himself approached by staff from various departments, each expressing appreciation for his candor and insights. The atmosphere had transformed from formal acknowledgement to genuine engagement. General Madison rejoined Jimmy as the crowd thinned. You've made quite an impression, Colonel, she observed. The Secretary has mentioned your name in 3 separate policy meetings since yesterday. Jimmy shook his head slightly. I'm just one veteran with one perspective. Sometimes one perspective, clearly articulated, is what's needed to catalyze change, Madison replied. Your experience yesterday exposed weaknesses in our systems that might otherwise have remained invisible to those of us working within them. She hesitated, then added, "There's another matter I'd like to discuss, if you have a few minutes." Madison guided Jimmy to a smaller conference room adjacent to the main hall. To his surprise, Staff Sergeant Torres was waiting inside, standing at parade rest, her expression a mixture of professionalism and apprehension. "At ease, Sergeant," Madison said as they entered, her tone firm but not unkind. "Colonel Mitchell, Sergeant Torres has requested an opportunity to speak with you directly. I believe her perspective may be valuable to our broader understanding of yesterday's events." Jimmy nodded, curious rather than resentful. He had never blamed the young sergeant for following established protocols, regardless of their impact. Torres stepped forward, her posture military precise despite her evident discomfort. "Colonel Mitchell, I wanted to apologize personally for yesterday's incident. My handling of the situation reflected a failure to recognize the very purpose of the event I was securing." She continued with admirable directness. "I've spent the last 24 hours reflecting on how I could have approached the situation differently. The regulations I cited were real, but they weren't absolute. I had discretionary authority I failed to exercise." Jimmy studied the young sergeant, seeing not just regret, but genuine introspection. "What would you have done differently with hindsight?" he asked, genuinely interested in her perspective. Torres didn't hesitate. "I should have recognized the significance of your personal invitation from Colonel Hayes. I should have contacted her directly rather than dismissing its validity. Most importantly, I should have considered the purpose of the event itself, to honor veterans of Quang Tri, and recognize that your presence aligned perfectly with that purpose, regardless of technical credentials." She squared her shoulders. "Since yesterday, I've requested additional training in veteran engagement and historical awareness. I've also submitted a formal recommendation that security personnel receive specialized briefing before veteran-focused events." Jimmy was impressed by her initiative and candor. "That's a thoughtful response, Sergeant. Few people reflect so constructively on challenging situations." General Madison nodded approvingly. "Sergeant Torres volunteered for reassignment to our veteran liaison team and has already contributed valuable insights from a security perspective." She turned to Jimmy. "This is how institutional change begins, not just with policy directives from above, but with individual commitment to improvement." The conversation continued, evolving from a simple apology into a productive exchange about balancing security requirements with accessibility. Torres offered practical suggestions based on her frontline experience, while Jimmy provided perspective on how certain procedures might be perceived by older veterans. Madison observed their dialogue with evident satisfaction, occasionally contributing broader institutional context. As they concluded, Madison addressed Torres directly. "Sergeant, would you excuse us for a few minutes? I have a private matter to discuss with Colonel Mitchell." After Torres departed, with a crisp salute, Madison's expression grew more serious. "Colonel, there's another dimension to yesterday's events that I haven't yet shared publicly." She removed a folder from her briefcase and placed it on the table between them. "When your name surfaced during yesterday's incident, I recognized it immediately. Not from the ceremony briefing, but from historical records I'd reviewed during my graduate studies at the War College." She opened the folder, revealing documents stamped with decades-old classification markings, now declassified. "Your radio transmissions from Quang Tri weren't just tactically significant," Madison continued. "They were pivotal in a way few people, even those attending yesterday's ceremony, fully understand." Jimmy's expression remained neutral, though. His eyes reflected recognition of documents he hadn't seen in 50 years. "According to these after-action reports," Madison said, "your coordination of artillery support during the critical 48 hours of the North Vietnamese advance wasn't just effective. It was the primary factor preventing a complete breach of the defensive perimeter. Your transmissions directly saved an estimated 400 American lives. She turned to another document. More remarkably, you maintained communications despite sustaining shrapnel wounds that would have justified immediate evacuation. You continued coordinating fire missions for 22 hours after being injured. Jimmy shifted slightly in his chair, uncomfortable with this recitation of actions he'd never discussed outside mandatory debriefings. "We all did what was necessary," he said quietly. "Nothing extraordinary about fulfilling one's duty." Madison closed the folder gently. "Except that your actions were extraordinary, Colonel, and they were never fully recognized." She met his gaze directly. "The Silver Star you received acknowledged your service, but according to these assessments, your actions at Quang Tri met the criteria for considerably higher recognition." Jimmy shook his head. "That was 50 years ago, General. Medals matter little at my age." "Perhaps," Madison acknowledged, "but accurate recognition of service matters to the institution and to history." She hesitated briefly. "With your permission, the department is prepared to conduct a review of your service. Record, there's substantial evidence supporting consideration for the Distinguished Service Cross based on actions documented in these reports." The offer caught Jimmy by surprise. After decades of civilian life, the prospect of revisiting his service record, of having his actions formally re-evaluated, seemed simultaneously meaningful and unsettling. He had long ago reconciled himself to the limited recognition his generation of veterans had received. Opening that chapter now would mean confronting memories he'd carefully compartmentalized. "May I ask why now?" Jimmy inquired, genuinely curious, rather than resistant. "After 50 years. Madison considered the question thoughtfully. "Yesterday's incident exposed how institutional blindness can cause us to overlook the very people we claim to honor. Your case represents a specific example of a broader pattern, recognition that was limited by the political climate of the era rather than the merit of service." She leaned forward slightly. "This isn't about a medal, Colonel. It's about institutional integrity, acknowledging where our systems failed to properly recognize service, particularly for Vietnam veterans who returned to a nation uncomfortable with their sacrifices." Jimmy was silent for a long moment, weighing perspectives shaped by decades of reflection. Finally, he nodded once. "If you believe this review serves a purpose beyond my personal recognition, if it might contribute to more accurate acknowledgement of others who served, then I consent." Relief flickered briefly across Madison's features. "Thank you, Colonel. This review will be conducted with appropriate discretion. You'll be consulted at each stage." She closed the folder and returned it to her briefcase. "There's one more item on today's agenda, if you're not experiencing too much Pentagon fatigue already." Jimmy smiled slightly. "I've endured longer operations under far less comfortable conditions, General." Madison laughed, the sound genuine and warm. "Fair point, Colonel. In that case, I believe the Secretary is hoping you might join a small working lunch. Several veterans organization representatives have expressed interest in hearing directly about your experience and the reforms being considered." The remainder of the day unfolded with a rhythm Jimmy hadn't experienced since his active service. Purposeful meetings, meaningful discussions, the sense of contributing to something larger than himself. The working lunch expanded to include congressional staffers responsible for Veterans Affairs legislation. Jimmy found himself describing not just yesterday's incident, but broader observations from his volunteer work at the VA clinic, the quiet struggles of veterans navigating systems not designed with their needs in mind. Throughout these conversations, Jimmy maintained his characteristic modesty, deflecting personal recognition to focus on systemic improvements. Yet he couldn't help noticing a shift in how others perceived him, not as an elderly veteran to be, politely acknowledged, but as a valued voice with experience directly relevant to current challenges. By late afternoon, the Secretary's Chief of Staff approached with an unexpected request. Would Colonel Mitchell consider delaying his return to California by several days to participate in a formal announcement of the new Mitchell Protocols for veteran accessibility? As they walked toward the auditorium, she spoke quietly. Colonel Mitchell, your radio transmissions were part of my training curriculum at West Point. Maintain clarity under pressure. That was the lesson your communications exemplified. When everything was chaos around you, your voice remained steady, ensuring artillery support reached the right coordinates, preventing friendly fire incidents, coordinating medical evacuations. Jimmy looked surprised. They used my transmissions for training. Madison nodded. They still do. Your call signs might be historical artifacts now, but the principles of clear communication under extreme pressure remain relevant to every officer we train. She paused at the auditorium entrance. You thought you were coming here to be recognized for past service, Colonel. The truth is, your service never stopped. Every officer who learned from your example carries a piece of your legacy forward. As they entered the auditorium, conversations hushed. Heads turned to observe the unexpected pairing, the current vice chair of the Joint Chiefs escorting an elderly veteran in a vintage uniform. Colonel Rebecca Hayes broke away from a group near the main display, her expression shifting from concern to relief. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, she called, hurrying toward them. I was beginning to worry. We've been waiting for you before beginning the presentation. She glanced at General Madison with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. Thank you for escorting our guest of honor, General. Madison smiled. The honor is mine, Colonel Hayes, though it seems our security protocols need some adjustment when they bar entry to the very people we're gathering to recognize. Hayes looked mortified. There was a security issue. I should have personally... It's resolved now, Jimmy interjected gently, not wanting to cause further disruption. And I'm here, which is what matters. General Madison nodded approvingly at his gracious response. Colonel Mitchell, I believe your seat is in the front row. Would you allow me to join you? I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on how we've represented the tactical situation at Quang Tri. The ceremony proceeded with Jimmy seated prominently beside General Madison. When the lights dimmed and the first of his preserved radio transmissions played through the auditorium speakers, a wave of emotion passed visibly across his weathered features. His own young voice, tense but controlled, coordinating artillery, support amid the chaos of one of Vietnam's most crucial battles. Fire mission, grid 842791, confirm danger close. I say again, danger close. The recording continued, Jimmy's voice from 50 years earlier guiding fire support that would ultimately help hold the line at Quang Tri against overwhelming odds. In the darkened auditorium, several older veterans wiped away tears, recognizing in those transmissions their own experiences, the terror, the discipline, the brotherhood that transcended fear. When the presentation concluded and the lights rose, Secretary of Defense William Carson approached the podium, his prepared remarks set aside as he gestured toward Jimmy. Ladies and gentlemen, we had planned an elaborate ceremony today with carefully scripted recognitions, but sometimes the most powerful statements are unplanned. He looked directly at Jimmy. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, your presence here today and the small obstacle course you navigated to join us reminds us all of an essential truth. We don't honor veterans by hanging their photographs in hallways or playing their voices through speakers. We honor them by recognizing their continuing dignity, their enduring value to our nation. The secretary paused, looking around the auditorium. Today was meant to commemorate events from 50 years ago. Instead, it has become a lesson for the present. When General Madison broke protocol to personally escort Colonel Mitchell into this ceremony, she wasn't just correcting an administrative oversight. She was demonstrating the very values that make our military great, recognizing that behind every protocol, every regulation, every security measure must be a foundation of respect for those who have served. The remainder of the ceremony unfolded with a newfound authenticity. Jimmy was invited to speak briefly about his experiences, his quiet words carrying more impact than the most polished official presentations. Afterward, younger officers sought him out, eager to connect with living history. Colonel Hayes ensured he had ample time to view the exhibit his recordings had helped shape, listening attentively as he offered gentle corrections to certain details. As the event concluded, General Madison approached Jimmy once more. "Colonel Mitchell, there's a small reception for key participants. Your presence would be valued if you're not too tired from all this fuss." Jimmy smiled. "Not too tired, General, though I admit this is more attention than I'm accustomed to these days." Madison nodded understandingly. "The spotlight can be uncomfortable, especially for those who served when recognition wasn't freely given." She hesitated, then added, "Your generation of veterans returned to a country that often failed to distinguish between policies they disagreed with and the service members who fulfilled their duty with honor. That was our failure, not yours." The reception offered Jimmy an opportunity few veterans of his era had received, the chance to share his experiences with those currently shaping military policy and culture. He spoke not of heroics, but of practical matters, the importance of clear communication, the value of training that held up under pressure, the need for systems that recognized humanity within necessary protocols. Staff Sergeant Torres appeared, at the reception's edge, hesitant until Jimmy noticed her and gestured her forward. "Sergeant," he greeted her without resentment, "enjoying the event?" "Yes, sir," she replied, clearly uncomfortable. "Colonel Mitchell, I wanted to apologize. Properly. I was so focused on following procedures that I lost sight of why those procedures exist in the first place." Jimmy's expression softened. "You were doing your job, Sergeant. Rules exist for good reasons. But rules without judgment become barriers," she responded, echoing General Madison's earlier sentiment. "I won't make that mistake again." Later, as the reception wound down, Secretary Carson announced a new initiative, a comprehensive review of ceremonial protocols to ensure veterans of all eras could participate in commemorative events without unnecessary barriers. The program would be called Mitchell Protocol Reforms, a recognition that struck Jimmy as both surprising and humbling. General Madison walked Jimmy to his waiting transportation, their conversation turning from past battles to present concerns about veteran accessibility and recognition. "Your experience today will change things, Colonel," she assured him. "Sometimes it takes an incident like this to remind institutions that our primary purpose is to serve people, not processes." Jimmy considered this thoughtfully. In the field, we had protocols too, critical ones that saved lives, but we also understood when circumstances required adaptation. Perhaps that balance is what's needed here. Madison nodded. Wisdom worth remembering. She extended her hand. "It's been an honor, Colonel Mitchell, truly." As Jimmy's car pulled away from the Pentagon, he reflected on the day's unexpected turns. He had come seeking connection with his past and found himself influencing the future instead. The recognition of his service, not just in ceremony, but in the practical impact of the Mitchell protocols, represented something he had never sought but deeply appreciated. The acknowledgement that veterans remain valuable, not just for what they did, but for what they continue to offer. Back in his hotel room that evening, Jimmy carefully hung his uniform in the closet. His phone chimed with messages from Colonel Hayes, photographs from the event, news that his recordings would be made available to military training programs nationwide, an invitation to consult on future historical projects if he was willing. For the first time in years, he felt reconnected to the institution that had shaped his youth, not as a relic of the past, but as a contributor to its evolution. The barriers he'd encountered that morning had revealed weaknesses in the system, but the response to those barriers demonstrated its capacity for growth. As he prepared for sleep, Jimmy noticed a small package that had been delivered to his room. Inside, a handwritten note from General Madison accompanied an official challenge coin bearing her insignia, a traditional token of respect within military circles. "Your voice guided artillery then," her note read. News of the previous day's events had spread rapidly through military circles. What began as an administrative oversight had transformed into a powerful moment of institutional reflection. A 4-star general-breaking protocol to honor a Vietnam veteran had become the story overshadowing the carefully planned centennial itself. Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell awakened to his hotel phone ringing. The front desk informed him that several news outlets had requested interviews. His first instinct was to decline. Publicity had never been his purpose in coming to Washington. When Carson introduced General Madison, the tenor of the briefing shifted subtly. Madison spoke not with a politician's careful neutrality, but with a commander's direct assessment of institutional shortcomings. The incident that catalyzed these reforms revealed not just procedural failures, but cultural blind spots within our institutions, she stated firmly. When Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell was initially denied entry to a ceremony honoring the very battle where his actions saved hundreds of American lives, it exposed how our focus on current protocols can obscure our primary mission, honoring those who served, particularly those whose recognition was limited by the politics of their era. Madison's forthright acknowledgement of institutional failures generated visible reactions among the assembled press corps. Military correspondents exchanged glances, recognizing the rarity of such candid self-criticism from Pentagon leadership. The Mitchell Protocols, Madison continued, represent more than procedural adjustments. They reflect a renewed commitment to seeing veterans as individuals with ongoing value to our institutions, not merely as historical figures to be commemorated at convenient intervals. When Madison completed her remarks, Carson returned to the microphone. "We're fortunate to have with us the veteran whose experience inspired these reforms. Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell's distinguished service in Vietnam included actions at the Battle of Quang Tri that demonstrated extraordinary courage under fire. Colonel Mitchell, would you share a few words about the significance of these changes from a veteran's perspective?" Jimmy approached the podium with the measured confidence of someone accustomed to responsibility rather than attention. He adjusted the microphone slightly, gathering his thoughts before addressing the assembled press. "I never sought recognition when I served," he began, his voice quiet but clear. "None of us did. We performed our duties because lives depended on it. The lives of the men beside us, the units relying on our support, the civilians caught in conflict zones." He paused briefly, surveying the attentive faces before him. What happened at the ceremony entrance wasn't unique or particularly significant compared to the experiences of many veterans. What makes it noteworthy is that it occurred in a place explicitly dedicated to honoring service, revealing how even well-intentioned systems can create barriers to the very recognition they're designed to provide. Jimmy's gaze moved across the cameras to the real audience beyond them, veterans watching from VFW halls, retirement communities, private homes across America. The reforms announced today matter not because they correct a single incident, but because they acknowledge a broader truth: that recognition of service isn't complete when the last medal is awarded or the final discharge papers are signed. True recognition continues in how institutions engage with veterans throughout their lives, how they're welcomed, how they're heard, how their experiences are valued. His words, unembellished by political flourish or dramatic emphasis, carried a straightforward authority that commanded attention. Many of my generation returned to a nation uncomfortable with our service. We didn't expect parades, but we didn't expect silence either. These protocols represent an institutional commitment to ending that silence, not just for Vietnam veterans, but for all who have served or will serve in the future. Jimmy concluded simply, "I'm honored to have played some small part in this progress, but the credit belongs to the dedicated professionals within the Pentagon and veterans organizations who transformed one incident into meaningful reform. Their commitment ensures that future veterans won't face the same barriers many of us encountered when seeking recognition not for ourselves, but for those who served alongside us, particularly those who never returned to receive any recognition at all." As Jimmy stepped back from the podium, the briefing room remained momentarily silent. Journalists who typically raced to ask follow-up questions, instead absorbing the unadorned sincerity of his remarks. Secretary Carson returned to the microphone, fielding technical questions about implementation timelines and budgetary considerations. Throughout the remainder of the briefing, however, reporters frequently referenced Jimmy's comments, their questions reflecting a deeper understanding of the reform's human significance. When the formal briefing concluded, Jimmy found himself surrounded by journalists seeking additional comments. General Madison intervened smoothly, limiting direct engagement while ensuring Jimmy wasn't overwhelmed. As they exited the briefing room, Carson leaned toward Jimmy. "Your remarks cut through the policy language to the heart of what these reforms represent," the secretary said quietly. "You accomplished in 3 minutes what our communications team couldn't achieve in 3 weeks of preparation, making the human impact unmistakably clear." The remainder of the day unfolded with unexpected developments. What had been planned as Jimmy's final day in Washington extended as additional requests emerged. A meeting with the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee chair, conversations with Pentagon personnel developing implementation guidelines, an interview with the Military Times focused on the service record review process. By evening, Jimmy found himself in an unfamiliar position, not as a passive recipient of recognition, but as an active participant in reshaping how recognition itself was defined and delivered. His hotel reservation was extended indefinitely, with the Pentagon covering all expenses as he continued consulting on implementation details. That night, alone in his hotel room, Jimmy called his neighbor in Riverside to check on his house and arrange for extended care of his small garden. As he described the unexpected turn of events, he found himself struggling to articulate the strange trajectory that had transformed a simple ceremony invitation into a comprehensive reform initiative. "Sounds like you found a new mission, Jimmy," his neighbor observed. "Not bad for a man who claimed he was fully retired." The comment lingered in Jimmy's thoughts as he prepared for sleep. He had indeed spent recent years in a kind of purposeful retirement, contributing through volunteer work, but largely disconnected from the institutions that had shaped his early adulthood. Now, unexpectedly, he had reconnected not just with the military establishment, but with his own identity as someone whose experiences held value beyond personal memory. The following morning brought new dimensions to Jimmy's evolving role. General Madison arranged a meeting with the team developing training materials for personnel who would implement the Mitchell protocols. The team included instructional designers, cultural sensitivity experts, and security specialists, all focused on translating policy directives into practical guidance. "Colonel Mitchell, we're hoping you might review our draft materials," explained Major Sophia Wilson, the team leader. "We've developed scenarios based on common interactions between institutional representatives and veterans of different eras." Your perspective would be invaluable in ensuring we're addressing real-world challenges rather than theoretical concerns. Jimmy spent hours with the team, reviewing scenarios that ranged from security checkpoints to commemorative ceremonies to benefits offices. Throughout, he offered insights drawn not from textbook understanding, but lived experience. The subtle ways institutional language could unintentionally alienate veterans, the importance of recognizing era-specific service markers, the value of providing options that preserve dignity while maintaining necessary security. The core issue isn't about relaxing standards, Jimmy observed during one discussion. It's about recognizing that respect can be conveyed through how regulations are implemented, not just what they permit or prohibit. Major Wilson nodded, thoughtfully. That distinction should be central to our training approach. Protocols without perspective become barriers rather than boundaries. As the consultation continued, Jimmy found himself impressed by the team's genuine commitment to meaningful reform rather than superficial adjustments. They asked difficult questions, acknowledged institutional blind spots, and repeatedly emphasized that effective implementation would require cultural shifts beyond procedural changes. By afternoon, what had been scheduled as a brief review session had evolved into a comprehensive workshop. Additional personnel joined remotely, including representatives from VA facilities nationwide, eager to align their practices with the Pentagon's reformed approach to veteran engagement. During a brief break, General Madison rejoined the group, bringing unexpected news. "Colonel Mitchell, your remarks at yesterday's briefing have generated significant response. The White House has expressed interest in incorporating elements of the Mitchell protocols into broader federal guidelines for veteran engagement." Jimmy looked surprised. "That seems disproportionate to a single incident." Madison shook her head. "It's not about the incident itself, but what it represents, how easily institutions can create barriers for those they claim to honor, particularly when those individuals don't conform to current expectations." She handed Jimmy a tablet, displaying media coverage of the previous day's announcement. Headlines emphasized not just the specific reforms, but the broader narrative. A Vietnam veteran's dignified response to institutional oversight, catalyzing comprehensive change. Several articles specifically quoted his remarks about veterans, returning to silence rather than recognition. "Your words resonated because they address something many veterans have experienced, but few institutional leaders have acknowledged," Madison explained. "The idea that recognition isn't complete when service ends, that it continues in how systems engage with veterans throughout their lives, that's a perspective that's been missing from policy discussions." The workshop resumed with renewed energy, extending well into evening. When it finally concluded, Major Wilson approached Jimmy with evident sincerity. "Colonel, would you consider serving as a consultant as we develop these materials? Your perspective has already transformed our approach significantly." The request represented another unexpected extension of Jimmy's Washington sojourn, another postponement of his return to familiar routines in Riverside. Yet he found himself nodding without hesitation, recognizing that his contribution here held significance beyond anything he had anticipated when accepting the original ceremony invitation. "I'll stay as long as I'm useful," he agreed simply. As Jimmy departed the Pentagon that evening, he encountered Staff Sergeant Torres in the main corridor. No longer assigned to security checkpoints, she now wore a newly created insignia identifying her as part of the Veteran Engagement Team, a specialized unit established under the Mitchell Protocols to ensure proper recognition across all Pentagon functions. "Colonel Mitchell," she greeted him with evident respect, "I'm glad to see you're still here. The training materials your consultation is shaping will be part of our team's core curriculum." Jimmy studied the young sergeant, noting the pride she took in her new assignment. How are you finding the transition from security enforcement to veteran engagement? Challenging but meaningful, sir, Torres replied honestly. It requires a different mindset, seeing beyond credentials to the person presenting them, recognizing that regulations serve people rather than the reverse. She hesitated, then added, I've been studying Vietnam-era service patterns to better understand the context veterans from your generation bring to interactions with our institutions. Her commitment to transformation, from enforcing barriers to building bridges, embodied the very cultural shift the Mitchell Protocols sought to achieve, not merely procedural adjustments, but fundamental recalibration of how institutions perceived and engaged with veterans across generations. The most effective security acknowledges the humanity it protects, Jimmy observed. Sounds like you're helping establish that balance. Torres nodded thoughtfully. That's exactly what we're working towards, sir. As Jimmy's car departed the Pentagon complex, he gazed back at the massive structure, a building he had once viewed as a distant symbol of military authority, now transformed in his perception to a dynamic institution capable of acknowledging failures and implementing meaningful change. The Mitchell Protocols would not reverse decades of insufficient recognition for Vietnam veterans, but they represented genuine commitment to ensuring future generations wouldn't face similar institutional barriers. His phone chimed with a message from General Madison. White House meeting confirmed for tomorrow. 10 dues. Car will collect you at 8:30. The President's staff is interested in your perspective on expanding these protocols government-wide. Jimmy set the phone aside, momentarily overwhelmed by the expanding implications of what had begun as a simple ceremony invitation. He had arrived in Washington expecting brief acknowledgement of his service. He would apparently depart having influenced how federal institutions approach veteran recognition nationwide. That evening, alone in his hotel room, Jimmy opened his laptop and began drafting notes for the White House meeting. As he worked, he found himself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought him here, from denied entry at a security checkpoint to consultation on presidential initiatives in less than a week. The true significance, he realized, lay not in his individual experience, but in what it represented, how institutional blindness could unintentionally perpetuate the very disconnection commemorative events were designed to address. His notes focused not on personal vindication, but systemic improvement, ensuring recognition extended beyond ceremonies to everyday interactions between veterans and the institutions established to serve them. As midnight approached, Jimmy set aside his work and moved to the window, gazing out at the illuminated monuments that defined Washington's skyline. Somewhere in the darkness beyond those symbolic structures, thousands of veterans like himself continued their lives. Many still carrying unacknowledged burdens, many still feeling disconnected from institutions that had shaped their youth. The Mitchell Protocols wouldn't heal all wounds or bridge all divides, but they represented acknowledgement that barriers existed, that recognition remained incomplete, when systems prioritized procedure over the very individuals those procedures were designed to honor. Jimmy's phone chimed again, not an official communication this time, but a message from Captain Rodriguez, who had driven him to the Pentagon that morning. Sir, just wanted to say I called my father after today's briefing. Told him about the Mitchell Protocols and the service record review process. First time I've heard him express interest in reconnecting with his unit. Thank you. That simple message, more than the high-level meetings or media coverage, crystallized the true significance of the reforms. Beyond policy documents and implementation guidelines, the Mitchell Protocols represented permission for veterans, particularly those whose service had been met with silence rather than recognition, to reclaim connections long severed by institutional indifference. Jimmy composed a brief reply to Rodriguez, then returned to the window, watching distant aircraft navigation lights trace paths across the night sky. Tomorrow would bring another unexpected chapter in this unfolding story. White House meetings, expanded initiatives, further postponement of his return to California. Yet for the first time since arriving in Washington, Jimmy felt no urgency to return to familiar routines. The quiet purpose that had sustained him through decades of civilian life had found new expression, not in retreating from institutions that had once overlooked his service, but in helping reshape how those institutions engaged with veterans across generations. In the reflection of the window glass, Jimmy caught glimpse of his own weathered features, lines etched by jungle heat and monsoon rains half a century earlier, eyes that had witnessed both humanity's capacity for cruelty and its profound resilience. He had once believed his most significant contributions lay in the past, preserved in classified reports and fading photographs. Now, unexpectedly, he found himself contributing to the future, ensuring that recognition of service extended beyond ceremonial acknowledgement to meaningful engagement throughout veterans' lives. The Mitchell protocols would outlast his consultation, potentially influencing how institutions recognized service for generations to come. As Jimmy finally prepared for sleep, he found himself recalling words from General Madison's message days. Earlier, some battles are won with artillery, others with wisdom. In the decades since Quang Tri, he had never anticipated fighting institutional battles on behalf of fellow veterans. Yet here he was, wielding not the radio that had once coordinated artillery, but the quiet authority of lived experience, transforming personal oversight into systemic improvement for veterans he would never meet. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to ensure the Mitchell protocols fulfilled their potential. But tonight, Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell, once denied entry to a ceremony honoring his own service, allowed himself a moment of satisfaction in knowing that future veterans might face fewer barriers because he had remained steadfast when institutional gates had initially closed against him. 6 months after Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell was denied entry to the Pentagon ceremony, he stood at the entrance of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., watching as veterans of all ages navigated the newly installed accessibility ramps. The polished black granite reflected the autumn light, names of the fallen etched in silent testimony to sacrifices made decades earlier. What had begun as a personal slight had blossomed into transformative change, extending far beyond Pentagon. Ceremonies to effect veteran recognition nationwide. The Mitchell protocols had evolved from departmental directive to federal standard, implemented across government agencies with remarkable speed. Jimmy had remained in Washington for 3 weeks following the initial press conference, consulting on implementation details before finally returning to his quiet home in Riverside. Today marked his first return to the capital since then, invited to witness the protocol's impact firsthand. "Quite a difference from your last visit," observed General Madison, who stood beside him at the memorial entrance. No longer in uniform, Madison had recently retired after 35 years of distinguished service. Jimmy was struck by the diverse gathering, veterans spanning conflicts from World War II through Afghanistan, family members, government officials, and citizens simply coming to witness a meaningful step toward proper recognition. Behind the ceremonial stage, Jimmy found himself among a distinguished group, congressional representatives who had championed legislation supporting the Mitchell protocols, military officials overseeing implementation, leaders from major veterans organizations who had shaped the reforms, and families selected to represent veterans receiving posthumous recognition under the new review process. Secretary Carson approached, extending his hand. "Colonel Mitchell, the President is eager to meet you before the ceremony begins." Jimmy followed Carson to a small room adjacent to the stage, where presidential security conducted final preparations. The president entered moments later, dispensing with formal protocol to greet Jimmy directly. "Colonel Mitchell, I've been looking forward to meeting you," the president said, shaking Jimmy's hand with genuine warmth. The Mitchell protocols represent the kind of institutional improvement that transcends partisan politics, recognizing that honoring service properly isn't a Republican or Democratic issue, but an American obligation. The president continued, displaying detailed knowledge of the protocol's implementation across federal agencies. What began as recognition of an oversight at a Pentagon ceremony has catalyzed re-examination of how government institutions engage with veterans across generations. That's a legacy few individuals can claim. Jimmy, uncomfortable with personal recognition, redirected attention to the broader significance. The protocols succeed because they address long-standing barriers that affected countless veterans, Mr. President. My experience merely illustrated systemic issues that veterans advocates had identified for decades. The president nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps, but systems rarely change without catalyst. Your dignity in response to institutional failure created space for reform that might otherwise have remained theoretical." Their conversation was interrupted by staff indicating it was time to begin the ceremony. The president led the way to the stage, where several hundred people had gathered in the plaza between the Vietnam Veterans Memorial and the new Recognition Center. Media platforms captured the historic moment, the culmination of reforms that had transformed veteran recognition across federal institutions. The ceremony proceeded with dignified efficiency. The president spoke eloquently about America's obligation to honor service across generations, acknowledging historical shortcomings while emphasizing renewed commitment to appropriate recognition. Secretary Carson detailed specific reforms implemented under the Mitchell protocols, from accessibility accommodations to the service record review process that had already identified thousands of veterans deserving upgraded commendations. When General Madison took the podium, her remarks focused on the cultural shift underlying procedural changes. "The Mitchell protocols represent more than policy adjustments," she stated firmly. "They reflect fundamental recalibration of how institutions perceive and engage with veterans, recognizing that honor isn't conferred through occasional ceremonies, but demonstrated through consistent respect in every interaction." Throughout these presentations, Jimmy remained seated among the dignitaries, uncomfortable with attention, but deeply satisfied by the reform's tangible impact. The true measure of success wasn't in ceremonial acknowledgement, but in the experiences of veterans like Master Sergeant Rodriguez finally receiving accurate recognition after decades of institutional oversight. As the ceremony neared conclusion, the president unexpectedly deviated from prepared remarks. "Before we formally dedicate this recognition center, I believe it's appropriate to hear from the individual whose experience catalyzed these reforms." He turned toward Jimmy. "Colonel Mitchell, would you share a few words about what these changes represent from a veteran's perspective?" Jimmy hadn't anticipated speaking and carried no prepared remarks. Yet as he approached the podium, he found words forming naturally, drawn not from rehearsed speech, but lived experience spanning half a century since his service in Vietnam. "When I was denied entry to the Pentagon ceremony 6 months ago," he began quietly, "I experienced momentary disappointment but little surprise. Many veterans of my generation grew accustomed to institutional barriers, to systems that honored service in principle while overlooking the individuals who actually served." He paused, surveying the diverse gathering before him. What transformed? That incident from personal oversight to meaningful reform wasn't General Madison's intervention. though I remain profoundly grateful for her recognition. The catalyst for change was institutional willingness to acknowledge that barriers existed, to recognize that honoring service requires more than ceremonies and monuments, but systems designed with veterans' actual experiences in mind. Jimmy gestured toward the recognition center behind him. This facility represents commitment to engagement rather than mere acknowledgement, to seeing veterans not as historical figures to be commemorated, but as individuals with ongoing value to their nation. That shift in perspective matters more than any policy directive or procedural adjustment. His gaze found Master Sergeant Rodriguez in the audience. For many who served in Vietnam, recognition comes decades later than it should have. The Mitchell Protocols cannot rewrite that history, but they ensure that future generations of veterans won't face similar institutional blindness, that their service will be honored not just through medals and monuments, but through systems that recognize their continuing dignity and value. Jimmy concluded simply, true recognition doesn't require grand gestures. It requires consistent respect, acknowledging service through how systems engage with veterans, not just what benefits they provide. The Mitchell Protocols succeed because they recognize that fundamental truth. As Jimmy returned to his seat, the assembled crowd rose in spontaneous standing ovation, not merely polite acknowledgement, but genuine appreciation for articulating principles that transcended his individual experience. The president resumed, the podium visibly moved by the response. Colonel Mitchell's words capture the essence of these reforms, the president observed. Recognition isn't complete when service ends. It continues in how institutions engage with veterans throughout their lives, acknowledging their sacrifices while honoring their continuing contributions to our national dialogue. With that understanding, the president formally dedicated the National Veteran Recognition Center, not merely as physical facility, but as embodiment of renewed commitment to honoring service across generations. As ceremonial ribbons were cut and doors officially opened, Jimmy remained seated, observing the culmination of reforms his experience had catalyzed, but countless individuals had implemented. The formal ceremony concluded, but the plaza remained, filled with veterans and families exploring the new facility. Jimmy found himself approached by individuals representing diverse service experiences, Vietnam veterans expressing appreciation for finally receiving institutional acknowledgement, younger veterans describing how the Mitchell Protocols had transformed their interactions with government agencies, family members sharing stories of posthumous recognition finally granted to loved ones who had served decades earlier. Throughout these conversations, Jimmy maintained characteristic modesty, acknowledging appreciation while emphasizing the collaborative nature of the reforms. Yet he couldn't help feeling profound satisfaction in witnessing tangible improvements, in how veterans engaged with institutions established to serve them. As the crowd gradually dispersed, General Madison rejoined Jimmy. The president has requested a private meeting with several key figures behind the Mitchell Protocols, she informed him. Your participation would be valued, but entirely optional. Jimmy nodded acceptance, following Madison to a conference room within the recognition center, where the president waited alongside Secretary Carson, congressional leaders, and representatives from major veterans organizations. Rather than formal briefing, the gathering evolved into thoughtful discussion of next steps, how to ensure the Mitchell Protocols remained vibrant rather than calcifying into mere procedural requirements. The challenge, observed the VFW representative, is maintaining cultural change beyond initial implementation. Procedures are relatively easy to modify. Institutional perspectives are far more resistant to lasting transformation. The president nodded thoughtfully. That's precisely why continued involvement from veterans like Colonel Mitchell remains essential. Reforms succeed when they reflect lived experience rather than theoretical understanding. The discussion continued, focusing on mechanisms to ensure veteran perspectives remained central to ongoing implementation. Throughout, Jimmy contributed measured insights drawn not from policy expertise, but practical understanding of veterans' experiences across generations. As the meeting concluded, the President addressed Jimmy directly. "Colonel, the Mitchell protocols have already transformed how federal institutions engage with veterans. Would you consider serving on the Oversight Committee, ensuring these reforms remain true to their original purpose?" The invitation represented unexpected extension of Jimmy's involvement, evolution from catalyst to guardian of reforms bearing his name. His first instinct was to decline, citing age and distance from Washington. Yet he recognized the importance of ensuring veteran perspectives remained central to implementation, particularly as original architects eventually departed. "I'll serve," Jimmy agreed simply, "though I believe the committee should include veterans from diverse service eras, not just Vietnam." The President nodded approvingly. "Already arranged. The committee includes representatives spanning World War II through Afghanistan, ensuring multiple perspectives inform ongoing implementation." As Jimmy departed the recognition center that evening, he paused at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, its black granite surface reflecting the setting sun. 50 years had passed since he'd coordinated artillery support during the chaos of Quang Tri. Half a century of carrying memories most civilians couldn't comprehend, of navigating systems often indifferent to veterans' experiences, of finding purpose beyond military service. He had never sought recognition for himself, focusing instead on honoring those who hadn't returned to receive any acknowledgement. Yet his experience, being denied entry to a ceremony honoring his own service, had catalyzed reforms, ensuring other veterans wouldn't face similar institutional barriers. A voice interrupted his reflection. "Colonel Mitchell?" Turning, Jimmy found Staff Sergeant Torres, Melanie now, approaching with evident purpose. "Before you leave Washington, there's something you should see." She guided him to a quiet corner of the recognition center, where a simple plaque hung beside the entrance to the Records Review office. The Mitchell Principles. Recognition isn't conferred through occasional ceremonies, but demonstrated through consistent respect in every interaction. Below this quotation from his impromptu remarks appeared the phrases that had become foundational to the training programs he had helped develop. See the individual, not just the veteran. Honor service through engagement, not just acknowledgement. Recognize that dignity transcends documentation. Remember that true recognition continues throughout life, not just at designated ceremonies. "These principles guide everything we do," Torres explained quietly. "They're incorporated into training for every staff member, from security personnel to benefits counselors. Your experience transformed not just what we do, but how we approach veteran recognition entirely." Jimmy studied the plaque with mixed emotions, uncomfortable with personal recognition, yet deeply satisfied that principles drawn from veterans' actual experiences now guided institutional approach. "The principles matter," he acknowledged. "The name attached to them doesn't." Torres shook her head slightly. "With respect, sir, the name matters precisely because it reminds us these aren't abstract concepts, but principles derived from actual experience, from what happens when institutions prioritize procedure over the very individuals those procedures were designed to honor." As they parted outside the recognition center, Torres offered a final observation. 6 months ago, I denied you entry to a ceremony because you didn't meet technical requirements. Today, thousands of veterans receive appropriate recognition because that incident forced institutions to reconsider what truly constitutes honor. Sometimes, she concluded thoughtfully, the most meaningful reforms begin with acknowledging our most fundamental failures. That evening, as Jimmy prepared for his return flight to California, he received an unexpected delivery to his hotel room. A shadow box containing his newly awarded Distinguished Service Cross, the result of service. Record review initiated under the Mitchell Protocols. The accompanying letter acknowledged that his actions at Quang Tri had merited this higher recognition decades earlier, offering apology for institutional failures that had delayed appropriate acknowledgement. Jimmy studied the medal thoughtfully, his mind not on personal recognition, but the thousands of veterans whose service would now be properly acknowledged through the review process he had helped establish. The Distinguished Service Cross represented not just acknowledgement of his actions at Quang Tri, but validation of the principle at the heart of the Mitchell Protocols, that honor requires accurate recognition regardless of when that recognition finally arrives. As he carefully packed the shadow box for transport home to California, Jimmy reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. From denied entry at a security checkpoint to catalyzing federal reforms that would affect veterans for generations to come. He had arrived in Washington seeking quiet connection with his past. He departed, having helped reshape how institutions engaged with veterans across eras. The following morning, as his flight lifted from Reagan National Airport, Jimmy gazed down at the capital city receding below. Monuments to past sacrifice gleaming white against the landscape, the Pentagon, a massive geometric presence by the river, the newly dedicated recognition center barely visible near the National Mall. Systems he had once viewed as distant and occasionally indifferent had demonstrated capacity for meaningful change when confronted with their own failings. 6 days later, back home in Riverside, Jimmy resumed his volunteer work at the local VA clinic. The Mitchell Protocols hadn't yet been fully implemented in this particular facility, though staff had received initial training materials. Yet Jimmy noticed subtle changes already taking effect: more attentive engagement with elderly veterans, greater sensitivity to era-specific service experiences, increased awareness of how institutional processes affected those navigating them. During a quiet moment between appointments, the clinic director approached Jimmy somewhat hesitantly. "Colonel Mitchell, we've received implementation guidelines for the Mitchell Protocols," she began, clearly unaware of his connection to the namesake reforms. "Since you volunteer with our Vietnam-era veterans, would you be willing to review our planned adjustments? Your perspective would be invaluable in ensuring we're addressing real needs rather than just checking bureaucratic boxes." Jimmy agreed, without revealing his role in developing the protocols, finding greater satisfaction in contributing anonymously than claiming credit for reforms bearing his name. For the next hour, he reviewed proposed changes to clinic procedures, offering insights drawn from decades of observing how veterans engaged with institutional systems. As he concluded this impromptu consultation, the director studied him with growing curiosity. "You know, Colonel Mitchell, your suggestions align remarkably closely with the official guidance, almost as if—" Her voice trailed off as realization dawned. "Are you related to the Mitchell whose name appears on these protocols?" Jimmy smiled slightly. "You might say I'm familiar with the circumstances that inspired them." Recognition spread across the director's features. "You're that Mitchell, the veteran who was denied entry at the Pentagon ceremony." Her expression reflected newfound understanding. "No wonder your suggestions cut straight to the heart of what these reforms are meant to accomplish." Jimmy nodded once, neither confirming nor denying her conclusion. What matters isn't who inspired the protocols, but how effectively they improve veteran experiences. If these adjustments help ensure veterans receive consistent respect rather than occasional acknowledgement, they'll have served their purpose. As Jimmy departed the clinic that afternoon, He paused briefly in the parking lot, watching older veterans arriving for appointments, some using canes or walkers, others moving with the slightly stiff gait that spoke of old injuries carried for decades. Each represented service rendered and sacrifices made, often with limited recognition beyond the moment of discharge. The Mitchell protocols wouldn't erase decades of institutional oversight or heal all wounds left by insufficient acknowledgement, but they represented genuine commitment to ensuring future generations of veterans wouldn't face similar barriers, that their service would be honored not just through medals and monuments, but through systems designed with their actual experiences in mind. For Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell, once denied entry to a ceremony honoring his own service, that commitment represented recognition far more meaningful than any individual commendation. Acknowledgement that honoring service requires more than ceremonies and citations, but consistent respect throughout veterans' lives. In that understanding lay the true legacy of reforms bearing his name. Recognition that transcended documentation, acknowledgement that continued beyond discharge. Honor demonstrated through engagement rather than mere ceremony. True recognition, as the Mitchell Principles stated, wasn't conferred through occasional ceremonies, but demonstrated through consistent respect in every interaction, a standard against which all institutional engagement with veterans would now be measured, ensuring. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Her transition to civilian life had been immediately followed by appointment as special advisor to the President on Veteran Affairs, a position created specifically to oversee implementation of the expanded Mitchell protocols. Jimmy nodded, watching as an elderly veteran in a wheelchair navigated the new ramp system with dignity, aided by a specially trained National Park Service guide wearing the distinctive Mitchell protocols insignia, a simple diamond-shaped pin depicting clasped hands beneath a service star. The physical accommodations are important, Jimmy acknowledged, but it's the shift in approach that matters most. He gestured toward a young guide who had knelt to speak eye to eye with a veteran using a walker rather than addressing him from a standing position. Dignity in interaction, that's the heart of meaningful recognition. Their presence at the memorial today wasn't coincidental. In 1 hour, the President would arrive to formally dedicate the National Veteran Recognition Center, a facility adjacent to the memorial complex dedicated to ensuring veterans of all eras received appropriate acknowledgement and support when visiting national monuments. The center represented the most visible manifestation of the Mitchell protocols, though far from the most significant. As they walked along the memorial wall, Madison updated Jimmy on developments during the month since his consultation. The Service Record Review process has identified over 3,000 Vietnam-era veterans whose actions merited higher recognition than originally awarded, she reported. The first upgraded commendations will be presented next month, with more following. As reviews continue, Jimmy nodded thoughtfully. While the high-profile nature of his case had generated substantial attention, the systematic review of service records represented the reform's most meaningful dimension, acknowledging that political climate and administrative inconsistencies had resulted in inequitable recognition for Vietnam veterans. And the training, programs? He inquired, referring to the materials he had helped develop during his extended stay. Implemented across 17 federal agencies, Madison replied, with evident satisfaction. The cultural sensitivity modules you helped design are now mandatory for all personnel who interact with veterans in any capacity. She paused, then added, "The feedback has been overwhelmingly positive, particularly from Vietnam and Korean War veterans who report feeling truly seen by government representatives, often for the first time." As they approached the center of the memorial, Jimmy noticed a familiar figure standing near the apex of the V-shaped wall. Staff Sergeant Torres, now wearing civilian attire but still instantly recognizable. Her presence surprised him. He hadn't. He'd seen her since departing Washington months earlier. Torres noticed their approach and straightened reflexively before catching herself and adopting a more casual posture. "Colonel Mitchell, General Madison," she greeted them with genuine warmth. "It's good to see you both again." "Melanie," Madison acknowledged, using Torres's first name, a small indication of their relationship's evolution since the former. "Sergeant had left military service. I thought you'd be at the center preparing for the dedication. Final walkthrough completed an hour ago," Torres replied confidently. "Everything's ready for the president's arrival." Jimmy studied the young woman with interest. "You're working at the Recognition Center?" The last he'd heard, Torres had been part of the Pentagon's implementation team for the Mitchell protocols. Torres nodded, evident pride in her expression. "I'm the Deputy Director for Outreach and Engagement. When they began staffing the center, General Madison recommended me for the position." She hesitated, then added with characteristic directness, "It felt right, continuing the journey that began with our interaction at the checkpoint." The symmetry wasn't lost on Jimmy, the security officer who had initially denied him entry, now dedicated to ensuring other veterans faced no similar barriers. Torres's transformation from enforcing regulations to championing recognition embodied the very cultural shift the Mitchell protocols sought to achieve. "The center is implementing several innovations based on your consultation," Torres continued, addressing Jimmy. "Would you like to see them before the crowds arrive for the dedication?" For the next 45 minutes, Torres guided Jimmy and Madison through the Recognition Center facilities, an elegant balance of practical accommodation and meaningful acknowledgement. Beyond physical accessibility features, the center incorporated elements specifically designed to honor veterans across generations. Multimedia stations where visitors could hear first-hand accounts from conflicts spanning World War II through Afghanistan. Interactive displays allowing veterans to connect with unit histories. Consultation spaces where veterans seeking information about benefits or recognition could speak with trained advocates in privacy and comfort. Most significantly, the center housed the newly established Office of Service Recognition Review, the permanent installation of what had begun as a temporary Pentagon initiative to reconsider Vietnam-era commendations. Staffed by military historians and record specialists, the office provided veterans a straightforward process to request review of service recognition without bureaucratic complexity. As they toured the facility, Jimmy noticed subtle but meaningful details, reflecting his input during the consultation process. Seating arranged to accommodate mobility limitations without segregating those requiring assistance. Historical displays that acknowledged the political complexities surrounding different conflicts without diminishing the service of those who fought. Staff trained to recognize era-specific service indicators without requiring veterans to repeatedly explain their history. "The center embodies what you emphasized during consultation," Torres explained as they completed the tour. "Recognition isn't about grand gestures but consistent respect, acknowledging service through how systems engage with veterans, not just what benefits they provide." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of administrative staff preparing for the presidential visit. The center's director, Dr. Angela Reynolds, herself a Gulf War veteran, approached with clipboard in hand, efficiently managing final preparations while greeting Jimmy and Madison warmly. "Colonel Mitchell, it's an honor to finally meet you in person," Reynolds said, extending her hand. "Your insights shaped every aspect of our approach here. The President has specifically requested you join the stage party during the dedication." Before Jimmy could respond, a familiar voice called his name. Turning, he was surprised to see Captain Rodriguez approaching, the young Marine who had driven him to the Pentagon during those tumultuous days 6 months earlier. "Colonel Mitchell," Rodriguez greeted him with evident pleasure. "I hoped you'd be here today." He gestured to an older man walking beside him, silver-haired, with the unmistakable bearing of a former Marine, despite civilian clothing. "This is my father, Master Sergeant Luis Rodriguez, 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, Vietnam." The elder Rodriguez extended his hand with quiet dignity. "Colonel, my son has told me about your contribution to the Mitchell protocols. I wanted to thank you personally." Jimmy shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip of someone who had carried far more than was visible. "No thanks necessary, Master Sergeant. The protocols simply acknowledge what should have been recognized decades ago." Luis Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps, but acknowledgement matters, even when delayed." He glanced at his son, then back to Jimmy. "After your press conference, I applied for the service record review. 30 days ago, I received notification that my Silver Star is being upgraded to the Navy Cross for actions during Operation Swift. After 50 years, someone finally reviewed the after-action reports properly. The simple statement carried profound weight. Decades of unacknowledged service finally receiving appropriate recognition through mechanisms catalyzed by Jimmy's experience. Luis Rodriguez wasn't seeking validation or praise. He simply valued accurate acknowledgement of service rendered in the nation's most divisive conflict. "The ceremony is next month," Captain Rodriguez added. Dad initially declined to attend, but changed his mind when he heard about the modifications implemented under the Mitchell protocols. Jimmy understood immediately. For many Vietnam veterans, the prospect of public ceremonies evoked uncomfortable memories of returning to a nation that offered little welcome and less understanding. The modifications Rodriguez referenced included options for private recognition, accommodation for family members affected by service-related trauma, and carefully designed environments that honored service without triggering combat memories. "Will you attend the ceremony, Master Sergeant?" Jimmy inquired. The elder Rodriguez nodded once. "Yes, not for myself, but for the men who didn't come home, whose families deserve to know their sacrifices weren't forgotten, even if belatedly." Acknowledged. Their conversation was interrupted by security personnel beginning pre-presidential arrival protocols. Dr. Reynolds approached again, gently directing Jimmy toward the staging area where dignitaries would gather before the formal dedication. As he moved through the growing crowd, the Pentagon's public affairs team hoped to arrange a joint press conference with Secretary Carson, General Madison, and representative veterans organizations. Jimmy's first instinct was to decline. Public attention had never been his objective, and extending his time in Washington meant disrupting his carefully structured routine back home. Yet as he considered the request, he recognized an opportunity to ensure the momentum for change wasn't lost once he departed. "I'll stay," he agreed finally, "on one condition: that veterans from other conflicts are included as well. This isn't about my experience specifically, but about improving recognition across generations of service." The Chief of Staff nodded, clearly pleased. "The Secretary anticipated your response. We've already begun coordinating with representatives from several veterans organizations spanning Korea through Afghanistan." As Jimmy departed the Pentagon that evening, escorted to his waiting car with a deference that would have been unimaginable 24 hours earlier, he found himself reflecting on the strange trajectory that had brought him here. He had arrived as an individual seeking quiet connection with his past. He would depart as a catalyst for institutional change. The car passed the checkpoint, where he had been initially denied entry. The security station was now staffed by different personnel, though Jimmy noticed a new sign prominently displayed: veterans' assistance available upon request. A small change, perhaps, but a visible indication that yesterday's failing had prompted immediate correction. His hotel room now contained delivery of an updated schedule for the extended stay, along with a handwritten note from Colonel Hayes. "Your voice has opened doors that have been closed too long. Thank you for your continued service." Jimmy placed the note on the nightstand and stood at his hotel window, gazing out at the illuminated monuments of Washington, structures dedicated to the ideals of service and sacrifice, gleaming white against the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring more meetings, more discussions, more opportunities to translate one incident of oversight into lasting improvement. He thought of the young soldiers whose voices were preserved in the Quang Tri recordings, many who hadn't lived to see their service recognized in any ceremony. He thought of fellow veterans who had returned from Vietnam to indifference or hostility rather than appreciation. He thought of Staff Sergeant Torres transforming her mistake into commitment to improvement. In the reflection of the window glass, Jimmy caught glimpse of his own weathered features, lines etched by years of carrying memories most civilians couldn't comprehend. For decades, he had believed his most significant service lay in the past, documented in classified reports and fading photographs. Now, unexpectedly, he found himself serving again, this time by ensuring those who followed would receive the recognition their sacrifices deserved. Outside his window, the capital city continued its eternal rhythm. Monuments to past sacrifice illuminated, while new decisions shaping the future were made in buildings beyond his view. Jimmy Mitchell, once denied entry to a ceremony honoring his own service, now found himself at the center of a different kind of recognition, not of a single veteran, but of the enduring obligation to honor service across generations. The morning of the press conference dawned with unexpected intensity. What had been planned as a modest policy announcement had evolved into something far more significant. 3 major networks had confirmed coverage alongside veterans' advocacy, journalists and military correspondents from across the country. The Pentagon briefing room, typically reserved for matters of national security, would today focus on an issue rarely granted such prominence: how institutions honor those who served decades earlier. Jimmy stood before the mirror in his hotel bathroom, carefully knotting his tie, navy blue with subtle diagonal stripes, purchased the previous evening when it became clear his extended stay would require additional civilian attire. His fingers moved with practiced precision, despite their slight arthritis. The face reflected back at him seemed somehow different from the one he'd grown accustomed to seeing. The same weathered features and silver hair, but with a renewed sense of purpose illuminating his eyes. A knock at his door announced the arrival of his Pentagon escort. Today, it wasn't Colonel Hayes, but a young Marine captain who introduced himself as Rodriguez, veteran of 3 Afghanistan deployments. As they rode toward the Pentagon, Rodriguez spoke with surprising candor. "Your story has become something of a legend already, sir," the captain said, navigating morning traffic with practiced ease, especially among younger officers. The image of General Madison saluting you while you stood outside that checkpoint, it's made quite an impression. Jimmy shook his head slightly. Seems a small incident to generate such attention. Rodriguez glanced at him. "With respect, sir, it resonated because it exposed something many of us have observed but few have addressed. How military institutions sometimes honor the idea of service more effectively than the individuals who actually served." "Oh," he paused, then added, "particularly from Vietnam. My father was Marines, Da Nang province, 68 to 69. He never felt his service was properly recognized." The personal connection surprised Jimmy. "Your father influenced your decision to enlist?" "Absolutely, though he was initially against it," Rodriguez replied. But his stories, not about combat but about the men he served with, showed me what true brotherhood looks like. He never got a proper welcome home. I think that's why today's announcement matters more than the Pentagon might realize. Upon arriving at the Pentagon, Jimmy was ushered not to the briefing room, but to a smaller conference area where Secretary Carson waited alongside General Madison and representatives from major veterans organizations. The gathering included leaders from the VFW, American Legion, Vietnam Veterans of America, and newer groups representing post-9/11 service members. Carson greeted Jimmy warmly. "Colonel Mitchell, before we face the media circus, I wanted us to review the announcement privately." He gestured toward the diverse group of veterans advocates. "These leaders have been instrumental in shaping what we're calling the Mitchell Protocols, ensuring they address needs across service generations." Jimmy nodded respectfully to the assembled representatives, uncomfortable with the initiative bearing his name, but recognizing the importance of the reforms themselves. "I appreciate the collaborative approach, Mr. Secretary. This was never about my individual experience." "Perhaps not," interjected Frank Delgado, the Vietnam Veterans of America representative, "but your experience crystallized issues we've raised for decades. Sometimes it takes a specific incident to illuminate a systemic problem." Delgado, a former Army medic who had served near the DMZ in 1967, extended his hand to Jimmy. "Most of us returned to a country that wanted to forget we existed. Having the Pentagon publicly acknowledge that institutional barriers have prevented proper recognition, that's significant progress, brother." For the next 30 minutes, the group reviewed the announcement details. The Mitchell Protocols address not just security procedures, but comprehensive reforms to veteran recognition programs, regional ceremonies making commemorative events more accessible to aging veterans, transportation assistance, accommodation for period-appropriate uniforms, training for personnel interacting with veterans, and dedicated liaison officers at major events. Most significantly, the Pentagon would establish a formal review process for Vietnam-era service records, acknowledging that political climate and administrative inconsistencies had resulted in inequitable recognition. Veterans whose actions merited higher commendations would have their records reconsidered using standardized criteria applied to later conflicts. As they prepared to move to the briefing room, General Madison drew Jimmy aside. "Colonel, the Secretary has asked if you would consider making brief remarks during the announcement. Nothing elaborate, just a few words about why these changes matter from a veteran's perspective." Jimmy hesitated. Public speaking had never been his strength, and the prospect of addressing national media was daunting. Yet he recognized the opportunity to ensure the reforms weren't perceived as merely bureaucratic adjustments, but as meaningful recognition of veterans' experiences. "I'll speak," he agreed quietly, "though I'm more comfortable coordinating artillery than addressing cameras." Madison smiled. "Sometimes the most effective communications are the least rehearsed, Colonel. Your authenticity is precisely what makes your perspective valuable." The briefing room hummed with anticipation when they entered. Cameras tracked their progress. To the podium, where Secretary Carson took position at the central microphone, General Madison stood to his right, with Jimmy and the Veterans Organization representatives forming a backdrop that visually represented the collaboration behind the initiative. Carson began with practiced diplomatic skill, framing the announcement within broader Department of Defense commitments to honoring service. He outlined the specific reforms constituting the Mitchell Protocols, emphasizing their development through consultation with veterans spanning multiple conflicts. Throughout his presentation, cameras occasionally panned to Jimmy, whose composed expression revealed little of his internal discomfort with the attention.